We are taking a closer look at Special Counsel Jack Smith's 165-page filing against former President Donald Trump. And joining me now is Jose Paglieri, an investigative reporter with All Britain Journalism Institute's Notus. Jose, thank you so much for joining us. Right off the bat, I want to ask you, what is new in this filing? Because we're getting some behind-the-scenes things here, but it wasn't necessarily shocking.
Right. I mean, let's put it in historical context for just a second. This would be an explosive report at any point in time during our country's history. The only reason it doesn't feel that way is because we've been hearing it for the last 4 years, right? I mean, ever since January 6th, we've heard it from the January 6th committee. We've heard it from a lot of journalists like myself that have slowly pulled out details about what exactly went on in the White House in the run-up to the insurrection. But the explosiveness of the report is still there. It's just a matter of picking it apart. And so I can highlight a few things that we now know that we didn't know before. One of them is the extent to the former president's personal involvement in trying to deny the legitimate election results, with the prosecutors noting that he told campaign advisors and even Vice President Mike Pence's chief of staff that he would simply declare victory before the ballots were actually counted. That was the plan from the start. On a second note, we also know now that Trump apparently told a family member that, quote, "It doesn't matter if you won or lost the election, you still have to fight like hell." And the third point is that Trump actually called Rudy Giuliani, who was his lawyer at the time, just before Giuliani appeared before the Georgia Senate, where he delivered a basket of lies about supposed election fraud and also put a target on the back of 2 poll workers who later sued him for defamation and won. And so the real purpose of this report, which was to sort of separate the point between Trump's official duties as president and his personal campaign to try to stay in office, was delivered with this report. Jack Smith and his prosecutors have essentially laid out how they view Donald Trump's personal involvement, and it's extensive.
Right. This is a love letter or not so love letter to the Supreme Court after their decision July 1, basically saying there's some presumptive conduct here, especially his interactions with Vice President Mike Pence at the time and as he was president, that's presumptively immune, but there could be cracks in that ceiling. Now, how did they frame some of those interactions with Vice President Mike Pence to kind of get around what the Supreme Court suggested was maybe entitled to some presumptive immunity?
That's right. I mean, let's talk about what exactly the Supreme Court did. They really set the stage for Jack Smith and his prosecutors to define how in the world is this not part of your official job as president. And the way that Smith responded was by saying, well, when Trump spoke to Mike Pence, it wasn't a president speaking to the vice president. It was a failed presidential candidate speaking to the president of the Senate and asking Pence in his capacity as president of the Senate, that's legislative, not executive, to interrupt the certification of the election. And so they're essentially qualifying the terms here and trying to recast it, which, look, some people might say that's a cheap move, but I certainly don't think so, because in the end, Pence wasn't acting as vice president when he was being asked to do this. He was the president of the Senate. He had no power as vice president to intervene, but as president of the Senate, that's where he would be essentially certifying the vote. And so the prosecutors were trying to pull Trump essentially out of that fortress of the White House that the Supreme Court has essentially turned into this impenetrable wall.
We heard earlier in the show from a former Trump staffer who said, look, this is bad, and not thinking about it being bad for Trump, but this is bad for democracy because this might bring some folks out of the woodworks that think, all right, the thumb is on the scale here. This is coming out right before the election. This didn't have to happen right now. What do you think of that analysis?
You know what? Let's take that in 2 points. It certainly did not need to happen right now. We as a country did not need to have an October surprise where a 165-page report was coming out against the top Republican candidate. But the only reason it's coming out now is because, 1, the Attorney General delayed the start of this case from the beginning. 2, the Trump legal team delayed this case for an entire year, and they fought it all the way to the Supreme Court, which 3 held back making a landmark decision for months. I mean, the Supreme Court made the decision in the huge Nixon case in a few weeks. In this one, they took more than 2 months. And when they finally did, they sent it back to the trial court with a long laundry list of things to do. And the trial court is trying to get through that now as fast as she can.
And a difficult decision to parse.
Is because of those delays.
Right. A difficult decision to parse, as she suggested at one of the hearings right after the Supreme Court's decision. Real quickly at the end, I want to ask you, we're still waiting on another shoe to drop here.
That's right, because all we've seen is the report. What we haven't seen are all of the grand jury transcripts and interviews and testimony that it cites. And that's where things could get really interesting, because so far Mike Pence has stayed relatively quiet in public, but we could soon find exactly what he told investigators. And that might not have a lot to do with the case at hand, but it could certainly sway voters before they make a decision in November with all the details about what exactly his former vice president truly thinks about him.
All right, Jose Paglieri, thank you so much for your deep dive on this. And we look forward to hearing from you maybe when we get that appendix. Appendices always fun to talk about on this show.
Absolutely. Thank you.
All right.